The winter of 1878 came down on the Colorado Territory like a hammer on an anvil, hard and final, and Timothy Ralston spent every single night of it building furniture for a woman he had not yet met. He had purchased the land the previous spring, a generous 40 acres of grassland and pine-edged hills just east of the small but growing town of Harlan's Creek, Colorado, where the soil was dark and rich, and the creek that wound through the lower pasture never fully dried up even in the driest months of July. He had built the house himself over the course of that summer, working from first light until his hands could no longer grip a hammer, hauling timber down from the hillside with his 2 draft horses, Biscuit and Fern, notching the logs by lantern light when the sun had gone down. It was a good house. It was more than a good house. It was a house that knew what it wanted to be, long before Timothy himself fully understood why he was building it the way he was building it. He put in 2 large windows facing east so the morning light would pour in across whoever was sleeping there. He built the porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs, though he owned only one. He designed the kitchen with a second shelf above the stove, positioned at a height that made no sense for a man of his stature, 5'11" and broad across the shoulders, but perfect for a woman of average height who would want her spices within reach without stretching. He did not examine these decisions too closely at the time. He simply made them, the way a man sometimes knows a road is the right road before he has any reason to say so. By the time October arrived and the first real bite of cold settled into the Colorado hills, the house was standing and the roof was solid and the fireplace drew clean and hot, but the inside was bare. There was a bedroll on the floor. There was a single crate turned upside down that served as a table. There was nothing on the walls and nothing beneath his boots but packed earth and rough-hewn floorboards. It was his neighbor, old Herschel Prout, who suggested the furniture. Herschel ran a small cattle operation to the north of Timothy's land, and he had come over one evening in late October to share a bottle of rye whiskey and to inspect the new house with the keen eye of a man who had built 3 homes of his own over 60-some years of living. "You've got good bones here, Ralston," Herschel had said, walking the perimeter of the main room and tapping on the walls with a knowing knuckle. "Solid work. Better than solid. But a man can't live in an empty box." He paused, looking at the bedroll on the floor, then looked at Timothy with his sharp gray eyes. "You planning on bringing a woman into this place?" Timothy had said nothing for a moment. He poured them both a measure of whiskey into 2 tin cups and handed one to Herschel. "I haven't got a woman," he said. "That wasn't what I asked you," Herschel said. Timothy looked at his cup. "I suppose I'm building the kind of house a woman would want to live in," he said finally. "Whether or not there's one who'll have me." Herschel had smiled at that, the long, slow smile of a man who recognized something true when he heard it. "Then you ought to fill it up," he said. "A house says something about the man inside it. You want a woman to walk through that door someday and know she's wanted. Make it a place she'd want to stay." Timothy had thought about that for the rest of the night after Herschel went home, sitting by the fire with his whiskey and the sound of the wind working at the eaves, and by morning he had decided. He would build the furniture himself. He had some skill with wood. His father had been a carpenter back in Ohio before the war had taken everything and scattered the family west, and Timothy had spent enough hours in that Ohio workshop as a boy to have absorbed the principles of joinery and proportion without ever quite intending to. He had a decent set of tools, a drawknife and a spokeshave and a hand plane and a good collection of chisels, and he had access to timber. He ordered a quantity of seasoned pine from the lumber operation over in Garnet Falls, and when the first hard snow came in November and the cattle were settled and the fences checked and there was nothing left to do but survive the cold, he started building. He built a dining table first. He built it long and wide, longer and wider than any single man needed, with legs mortised and tenons so cleanly that the joints would outlast his grandchildren. He shaped the edge of the tabletop with a gentle roundness so that no one would knock a sharp corner getting up in a hurry. He sanded it until the wood was smooth as river stone, and then he sanded it again. He rubbed it with linseed oil and let it cure for a week, and when he was done it gleamed a warm amber in the firelight, and it was, he thought, the finest thing he had ever made with his hands. He built 4 chairs to go with it. Then he built 2 more, because a table like that deserved 6 chairs, and because he was beginning to understand that he was not just building furniture but building a life in miniature. A life that had room in it for people, for children perhaps, for neighbors and laughter, and the kind of Sunday dinners that went on longer than they needed to because nobody wanted to be the first one to stand up and leave. He built a rocking chair next, a proper one with curved rails and a high back, and spindles he turned by hand using a makeshift lathe. He rigged up in the corner of the room. He built it for the porch, but the cold was too fierce by then to put it out, so it sat by the fire, and he sat in it in the evenings and rocked and looked at the table and the chairs and thought about the woman who would someday sit in them. He tried not to think too hard about who she might be. He was 28 years old, and he had been on his own for 5 years, since leaving the ranch in Wyoming where he had worked after the war took his father and the farm in Ohio went to debt. He had saved carefully and quietly, putting away wages from 3 different ranches over 5 years, living lean and spending little, until he had enough to buy this land and build this house and start something that was his own. He had not had much time for courting, and the women he had met had mostly been the wives and daughters of other men, or women in the towns who were not looking for a man with calloused hands and a one-room house in progress. He was not a man who complained about his loneliness. He recognized it, the way you recognize the weather, and he managed it. But the winter of 1878, working through the cold nights with a fire going and sawdust on his clothes, building these beautiful sturdy things for a life that was still only a hope, he felt the loneliness more acutely than usual. He felt it in the second rocking chair he built in December, twin to the first, and set beside it on the porch where they would sit side by side come spring. He felt it in the 4-poster bed frame he began constructing in January, shaping the posts on his lathe until they were straight and true and satisfying, carving a simple pattern of leaves into the headboard because it seemed right, because whoever slept in that bed deserved something beautiful to look at. He finished the bed in late January. He built a chest of drawers in February, dovetailing the joints by hand in the cold evenings, fitting each drawer so it slid true without binding. He built a wardrobe in early March, tall and solid with a mirror panel he ordered from the dry goods store in Harlan's Creek, and when it arrived and he set it in place and looked at himself in it for the first time, he barely recognized the man looking back. His beard was thick and dark, and he was thinner than he usually was, and there was something in his eyes that he could not quite name, something that was not quite sadness but was not quite hope either. It was the look, he supposed, of a man who had built a beautiful life and had not yet found anyone to share it with. He was still standing there looking at himself when he heard the knock at his door. It was the 10th of March, 1879, a Thursday, and the snow was still deep on the ground, but the light had changed in the way that announced spring was thinking about coming. The knock was brisk and purposeful, 3 sharp raps, and Timothy pulled on his coat and opened the door to find Herschel Prout standing on the porch with his hat in his hands and a look on his weathered face that Timothy had not seen before. "I've got something to tell you," Herschel said, "and I'm hoping you'll take it in the spirit it's intended." Timothy stood back and let him in. The old man came inside and looked around at the room, now full of furniture, the gleaming table and its 6 chairs, the rocking chairs by the fire, the glimpse of the bed frame through the open bedroom door, and his expression shifted into something that looked very much like emotion, though Herschel Prout was not a man who showed emotion easily. "You've been busy," Herschel said. "The winter's been long," Timothy said. Herschel settled himself into one of the chairs at the table, and Timothy poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove, and they sat across from each other with the winter light coming through the east windows and the fire ticking steadily in the hearth. "There's a woman come to Harlan's Creek," Herschel said without preamble. "Arrived 3 days ago on the stage from Denver. She's a school teacher. The town's been trying to get a proper teacher out here for 2 years, and she answered the advertisement." He paused and turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She's a widow. Her husband died of fever down in New Mexico about 1.5 years ago. She's got no family left to speak of, nobody in Denver, and she's starting over." He looked up. "She's boarding with the Callaways for now, but she needs a more permanent situation. The town's offered her the schoolhouse for her classroom, but there's no living quarters attached." Timothy listened to all of this carefully. He was not sure yet what Herschel was getting at, though he had a feeling that was beginning to warm in his chest like a coal catching light. "Her name is Della Beckett," Herschel said. "She's 26 years old, and I met her this morning when I went into town for supplies. And she is, Timothy, she is the kind of woman you build a house for." The silence that followed that statement was the kind that had weight to it. "You haven't met me my whole life," Timothy said finally. "You've known me 4 years. 4 years is enough," Herschel said. "I know what I know." He picked up his coffee. "I'm not saying you should go propose to the woman tomorrow. I'm saying you ought to meet her. I'm saying the town is having a gathering on Saturday, a welcome for the new school teacher, over at the Callaways' place, and I am formally inviting you to come." Timothy looked at the table he had built, at the grain of the wood in the morning light, at the 6 chairs waiting patiently for people to sit in them. "All right," he said. He said it quietly, but inside something shifted, like a piece of furniture finally placed in the right spot, and the room looked better for it. He arrived at the Callaway house on Saturday afternoon with his hat brushed clean and his best shirt on beneath his coat, which was the dark brown wool one he saved for occasions. His boots were cleaned of mud. He had trimmed his beard. He had done all of these things with a casualness that did not fool even himself, because the truth was he had been thinking about Della Beckett since Thursday morning in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like anticipation. The Callaway house was crowded and warm, a fire going in the main room, the smell of baking and coffee, the sound of voices. Mee Callaway, a large, cheerful woman who kept the social life of Harlan's Creek running through sheer force of hospitality, met him at the door and took his coat and pointed him toward the refreshments. He got himself a cup of coffee and stood near the back of the room, looking at the people gathered, the ranchers and their wives, the shopkeeper and his family, a couple of the hands from the larger operation north of town, old Doc Mercer in his good vest. He was looking, without quite admitting it, for a woman he had never seen before. He found her near the window. She was standing with Mee Callaway and the minister's wife, holding a cup of tea in both hands and listening to something the minister's wife was saying with an expression of genuine attention that told him she was the kind of person who listened when other people spoke, rather than simply waiting for her turn. She was not tall, perhaps 5'4", and she had dark hair pinned up at the back of her head with a few loose strands escaping at her temples in a way that looked less like carelessness and more like the natural condition of hair that had opinions about being contained. She wore a dark green dress that was modest and well-made, and she had a quality about her that he struggled to name, a self-containedness, a steadiness, as though she had already weathered enough of the world to have a clear idea of who she was inside it. She laughed at something Mee Callaway said, a genuine laugh, short and bright, and she pressed her hand briefly to her collarbone as she laughed, and Timothy Ralston felt something happen in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time, possibly ever. Herschel materialized at his elbow with the timing of a man who had been watching for exactly this moment. "Come on then," he said, and before Timothy could object he was being guided across the room. "Miss Beckett," Herschel said warmly, "there's someone I'd like you to meet. This is Timothy Ralston. He's got the ranch just east of my place. Timothy's been one of the best neighbors a man could ask for." Della Beckett turned from the window and looked at him, and her eyes were a warm brown, direct and clear, with an alertness in them that suggested she took careful note of the world around her. Mr. Ralston, she said, and held out her hand in a manner that was more direct than was strictly conventional, but he liked it immediately. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm. "Miss Beckett," he said. "Welcome to Harlan's Creek." "Thank you," she said. "I'm told you're a rancher." "I am," he said. "Cattle mostly. I'm still in the early stages, only been on the land about a year." "Did you build your place yourself?" she asked with a curiosity that seemed genuine. "I did," he said, and then, because he was not a man who bragged, he added, "It needs work still, but it's standing." "That's more than can be said for most aspirations," she said, and there was something dry and honest in the way she said it, a humor that was not unkind but that did not perform itself. He smiled. He could feel Herschel Prout stepping smoothly backward and away, mission accomplished, leaving them to it. "What brings you to Colorado?" he asked. She considered the question for a moment. "Honest answer or polite answer," she said. "Honest," he said. She looked at her teacup briefly. "My husband passed away a year and a half ago," she said, "in New Mexico. I stayed in Denver for a while afterward because I didn't know what else to do. And then I realized that staying still was making things worse rather than better, and that I had a skill, which was teaching, and that there were places that needed teachers, and that moving toward something useful was better than standing still in grief. So here I am." She looked up. "That's the honest answer." "It's a good one," he said. She studied him for a moment. "Most people say they're sorry." "I am sorry," he said. "But that goes without saying, and you didn't ask for sympathy. You asked whether I wanted the honest answer or the polite one." Something changed in her expression. It was subtle, a small adjustment, like a door that had been only slightly ajar opening just a fraction wider. "You're perceptive, Mr. Ralston," she said. "Timothy," he said, "please." She hesitated just a beat. "Della," she said. They stood together by the window for the next 40 minutes, and the room moved around them the way rooms do when two people have found each other in a crowd, and the crowd becomes background. They talked about Colorado and about teaching and about cattle and about Ohio, which it turned out she had also passed through years ago on her way west with her family when she was a girl. They talked about books, and he was surprised to find that she had read some of the same ones he had, the few he owned and kept on a small shelf above his fireplace, and she was visibly surprised that he read at all, and then she was embarrassed about the assumption. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was presumptuous." "It's all right," he said. "Not many cowboys spend much time with novels." "Do you?" she asked. "When the winter's long enough," he said. "I've read everything I own 4 times over this past winter. I was thinking I might need to order something new from Denver." "What do you have?" she asked. He thought. "A very battered copy of Ivanhoe, a complete Shakespeare that belonged to my mother, David Copperfield, which I like better every time I read it, and a natural history of North America that I found in a saloon in Wyoming and have never been able to account for being there." She laughed, that same bright, genuine laugh. "I have 63 books in 4 crates on the stage," she said. "I was told I could not bring them all, and I brought them all anyway." 63, he said. "I know," she said. "It's too many." "It's exactly the right number," he said. She looked at him again with that measuring look, and this time the door in her expression opened a little wider still. "I have a feeling Harlan's Creek might be more interesting than I expected," she said. He rode home in the blue evening with the snow crunching under his horse's hooves and the sky going dark above the mountains, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt as though something had begun. Not just a possibility, but an actual beginning, a thing already in motion. He thought about what Herschel had said. She is the kind of woman you build a house for. He thought about the dining table with its rounded edges, the 6 chairs, the rocking chairs on the porch, the bed with the carved headboard, the wardrobe with the mirror. He thought about the second shelf above the stove. He rode home and put his horse away and stood in the middle of his main room for a long moment, looking at the furniture he had made through the winter. And he thought that a man could spend a whole winter building things for a life he hadn't yet been able to name. And then one Saturday afternoon, a woman could walk into his understanding of the word possible. and suddenly everything that had seemed like solitary stubbornness revealed itself to have been preparation all along. He did not sleep well that night, not out of anxiety but out of something more like aliveness, the kind of wakefulness that comes not from worry, but from the sense that the world has become suddenly and unexpectedly interesting. The spring of 1879 came in slowly, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes first, and then grudgingly releasing the hollows and the creek banks, and Timothy found reasons to go into Harlan's Creek more frequently than his ranch required. He needed nails. He needed to settle an account with the feed store. He needed to collect a letter from the post office, though there was rarely any letter, and he knew it. What he needed and what he got was the occasional crossing of paths with Della Beckett on the main street, or an exchange of words outside the general store, or sometimes, when circumstances aligned, a proper conversation on the steps of the schoolhouse where she was setting up her classroom. The schoolhouse was a single large room with 6 long benches and a blackboard and a stove in the corner, and not much else. And Della was making it into something through sheer force of will, and a quantity of educational materials from her 63 books that she considered appropriate for the various ages of the children, who would be arriving in 2 weeks when the spring session began. She was sorting and arranging and thinking out loud about curriculum when Timothy came by one afternoon, ostensibly to deliver a letter from Herschel that Herschel could have delivered himself, but had given to Timothy with an entirely transparent smile. "He lives 2 miles closer to town than I do," Timothy said, setting the letter on her desk. "Then why did he give it to you?" Della asked without looking up from the stack of primers she was sorting. "I have been asking myself the same question," he said. She looked up then, and the smile that appeared was small but real. "Did you want to help?" she asked. "I'm trying to sort these by reading level and I could use a second opinion." He helped her for 2 hours, standing at the desk while she handed him books and explained her system, and he organized them into the correct sequence on the shelves she had arranged along the east wall. He was not a school teacher and he had no particular expertise in the matter, but she explained things clearly, and it was a pleasure to follow her thinking, to see how her mind organized itself, practical and principled at the same time. "You're very good at this," he said, not as flattery but as an observation. "It's what I know how to do," she said. "I started teaching when I was 19, before my marriage. I taught in a schoolhouse in Kansas for 3 years. And after?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Marcus, my husband, he was a doctor. We traveled a good deal. New Mexico, Arizona. He was treating patients on the frontier, people who had no other access to medicine. It was important work." She paused. "He contracted a fever from a patient in the fall of 1877. He fought it for 6 weeks. She said this evenly, without drama, in the tone of someone who has told the story enough times to have found the calm center of it, though he could see in her careful stillness that the calm was earned and not effortless. "He sounds like a good man," Timothy said. "He was," she said simply. "A very good man." She set down the book she was holding. "I don't want you to think I'm still devastated. I was for a long time, but I'm not anymore, not in the way that makes a person useless. I've come through the worst of it. I'm here because I want to be here, not because I'm running from something." He looked at her steadily. "I believe you," he said. "Most people," she said carefully, "when they meet a widow, they either feel sorry for her or they're suspicious of her, as though a woman who's been married before is either a pitiful thing or a dangerous one." "I think you're neither," he said. She tilted her head slightly, and that measuring look came back, the one he was beginning to recognize as the look she wore when she was deciding how much to trust something. "No," she said, after a moment. "I suppose you don't, do you?" He walked home that evening feeling as though the world had acquired a particular texture that it had been lacking before, the way a room looks different when you move a piece of furniture into exactly the right corner, and suddenly the space makes sense in a way it didn't before. He came back to the schoolhouse the following week with a length of good timber and a set of tools, and built her a proper cabinet for her teaching supplies, which she had been keeping in a stack of crates, because the crates were unstable and she had already knocked one over twice. He mortised and tenoned the shelves and put a simple door on the front with a latch, and by the time he was finished, the afternoon had stretched into evening, and she had brought 2 cups of coffee from the stove, and they sat on the school steps in the mild spring evening and talked until the light was gone. She told him about Kansas. He told her about Ohio and Wyoming. She told him about the books she loved and why she loved them, which was less about the stories themselves than about what they did to a person's understanding of other people. He told her about the natural history book from the Wyoming saloon, and she laughed so hard at the details of its discovery that she had to set her coffee cup down. He told her about building his house. Not the furniture yet, that felt like too much to say, but the house itself, the summer of hauling timber and the winter of thinking about who would eventually live there. "You built the whole thing yourself," she said. "Mostly," he said. "Herschel helped with the roof. A man can't raise roof beams alone." "What does it look like?" she asked. He thought about how to describe it. "It looks like a place where someone ought to be able to be comfortable," he said. "Big windows on the east side so the morning light comes in. Wide porch, good fireplace." She was looking at him in the gathering dark, her coffee cup in both hands, and there was something in her expression he hadn't seen before, something softer than the composed self-sufficiency she usually carried. "That sounds like a home," she said. "It's trying to be," he said. "I'm still working on it." She was quiet for a moment. "It's a strange thing," she said, "to make a home in a new place after you've lost one. You have to decide what to keep and what to let go of, and it's not always clear which is which." She looked out at the darkening street. "I had a home with Marcus. It wasn't fixed to any particular place because we moved around so much, but it was real. And now I'm starting over, and sometimes I wonder if the home I build next will feel as real, or if it will always have a sort of," she searched for the word, "provisional quality, like something I put together from spare parts." "I think the realest things are often built from spare parts," he said. She looked at him. "How so?" "Well," he said slowly, thinking it through as he spoke, "when I built that house, I used timber from my own hill and lumber I ordered from 30 miles away and nails from the general store in town and techniques my father taught me in Ohio, and some I figured out myself from just looking at a problem. It's all spare parts. Doesn't make it any less solid." She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "That's a good way to think about it." They sat there for a while longer in the dark, the way people sit when they're not quite ready for the conversation to end. And the night air was cold enough that their breath showed, but neither of them moved to go in. And the main street of Harlan's Creek was quiet around them, and it was, Timothy thought, one of the finest evenings he could remember. He rode home in the full dark, and he thought he might be falling in love. He was not a man who had fallen in love before, not properly, not with the full weight of himself engaged in it, and so he was not entirely sure he was recognizing it correctly. But there was something about Della Beckett that engaged not just his admiration but his imagination, his sympathy, his best thinking. He was more alert in her company than he was outside it. He was more himself, somehow, and also wanting to be more than he was, not because she demanded it, but because she inspired it by simply being the kind of person she was. He thought about her when he was working cattle. He thought about her when he was doing the evening chores. He thought about her at night when he lay in the bed he had built and looked at the carved headboard in the dark. He thought about her with a kind of warm seriousness that he understood was not simply attraction, though it was that too, but was something more complicated and more sustaining. He visited the schoolhouse again, and then again. He found excuses, and she accepted them graciously without pointing out that they were excuses, which he appreciated. One afternoon he fixed the sticking hinge on the schoolhouse door. Another time he brought a load of firewood and stacked it neatly by the side wall. She brought him coffee each time, and they talked. They talked about everything. About the political situation in the territory, about the railroad coming through, about the displacement of the Ute people from their lands in western Colorado, which was being called progress by some, and which Timothy called by a harsher name, and which Della agreed with carefully, though she was aware of how few people in town would agree with them. These conversations mattered to him. Not just that she agreed with him, but that she thought about it, that she had views and wasn't afraid to say them to him, and that she wanted to know his. Spring moved toward summer. The school session began, and she was occupied with her students 5 days a week. The children of ranchers and shopkeepers, and a few from farther out who rode in or whose parents brought them. 12 students in all, ranging from 6 to 14. And she managed them with a calm authority that the older ones tested exactly once before deciding she was not going to be managed. Timothy heard about her teaching from the ranching families whose children attended, and what he heard was consistent. Miss Beckett was strict and kind in equal measure, and she made the children want to understand things rather than merely memorize them, and they were learning faster than anyone expected. He saw this himself once, riding past the schoolhouse on a Tuesday morning and hearing through the open window a discussion in progress about how rivers form, and hearing her voice asking questions rather than stating answers, drawing the knowledge out of the children rather than pouring it in, and the voices of the children responding with genuine enthusiasm. He pulled his horse up for a moment just to listen, and there was something about it, about her competence and her dedication, and the way she belonged to this place she had only just arrived in, that moved him more than he expected. He invited her to his ranch in May, asking formally and carefully, saying that she was welcome to come and see the place if she ever had a free afternoon, and that Herschel and his wife Margaret would be coming for Sunday supper, and she was welcome to join if she wanted company for the ride out. She accepted, saying she would be happy to come, and she said it without coyness or performance, simply a direct acceptance, and he appreciated that too. She came on the Sunday, riding out from town in the Prout wagon with Herschel and Margaret, and Timothy met them at the gate of his property and rode alongside as they came up the lane toward the house. He watched her face as the house came into view. The house sat on a slight rise with the creek visible in the hollow below and the pine-edged hills behind, and the late afternoon sun was hitting the east windows and making them glow amber, and the porch was wide and shadowed, and the 2 rocking chairs sat side by side in the late light. He had put some effort into the yard, clearing the winter debris and getting the kitchen garden started, and there was a smell of fresh earth and new grass. Della said nothing for a moment, she just looked. "You built this," she said finally, not as a question. "I did," he said. She looked at him. "It's beautiful, Timothy." He felt the use of his name with a warmth he could not entirely account for. "Come and see the inside," he said. He was nervous, he realized as he opened the door, more nervous than he had been about anything in a long time. This was the thing he had made through the winter, the furniture, the careful work of those cold months, and he was about to let her see it, and he could not quite separate the furniture from the feeling behind it, the longing and the hoping and the private conversation he had been having with a future he couldn't yet see. They walked in, all 4 of them, and Herschel and Margaret had been here before, and so they simply settled themselves at the table with the comfort of people who know a place. But Della stopped in the middle of the main room and turned slowly, taking it all in. The table with its 6 chairs, the rocking chairs by the fire, the shelves with the books, the curtains Margaret Prout had helpfully contributed in exchange for a fence repair, yellow cotton that let the light through and were the only truly warm color in the room. "Did you build the furniture too?" Della asked. He hesitated. "This past winter," he said. She walked to the table and ran her hand along the edge of it, feeling the smooth wood, the gentle round of the edge. She pulled out one of the chairs and examined the joinery without quite knowing what she was looking at, but sensing the quality of it by some instinct. She looked at the rocking chairs. "How long did it take?" she asked. "The whole winter," he said. "Most evenings." She turned and looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "You built 6 chairs," she said quietly. "A table that size needs at least 6 chairs," he said. She looked at him for another moment, and he thought he saw something move behind her eyes, some understanding or question, but she didn't say anything more on the subject. She followed him through to the bedroom where he showed her the wardrobe and the chest of drawers, and she ran her hand over the carved headboard in a gesture that felt almost reverential. "Leaves," she said, touching the carving. "It seemed right," he said. She turned from the headboard and looked at him, and something in her expression had changed. The composed self-sufficiency was still there, but underneath it, or perhaps alongside it, there was something more open, more wondering. "You're a remarkable man, Timothy Ralston," she said. He shook his head. "I just had a long winter and a set of tools," he said. "No," she said. "You had a vision of something and you built it. That's not nothing." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and they stood in the doorway of the bedroom in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was full of things neither of them had said yet. Supper was good. Margaret Pruitt had brought a pie, and Timothy had roasted a joint of beef, and there were potatoes and green beans from the first of the kitchen garden, and it was the first time the dining table had been used for its intended purpose. All 4 chairs on one side and the other occupied, people eating and talking, and the fire going and the lamplight making the room warm. And Timothy sat at the head of the table he had built through the winter, and thought that this was what he had made it for, this exact thing. And that the only thing missing was something he was not quite ready to name aloud yet. Afterward, while Margaret and Della were clearing the table and talking about the school, Herschel leaned over to Timothy and said, very quietly, "Well." "Well, what?" Timothy said. Herschel gave him the look that old men give young men when young men are being deliberately obtuse. "Don't waste too much time," he said. "She's going to be fine with or without you, which means you'd better be worth her choosing you." Timothy looked at Della across the room, laughing at something Margaret had said, her hands busy with the dishes, her hair escaping its pins again, and he thought that Herschel was absolutely right. He walked her back to the wagon when it was time to go, and they stood for a moment in the yard in the May evening, the stars beginning to come out, the creek sounds carrying up from the hollow. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for having me," she said. She looked at the house behind him. "I'm glad I got to see it." "I'm glad too," he said. A pause. She looked up at him, and the look was direct and clear, and he thought she was working something out. "Those 2 rocking chairs on the porch," she said. "Yes," he said. "You built them at the same time." "I did." She nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had been considering. "Good night, Timothy," she said. "Good night, Della," he said. He watched the wagon until it disappeared around the bend, and then he stood in his yard under the stars for a long while, and when he finally went inside and sat in one of the rocking chairs by the fire, the empty one beside it seemed more present than it ever had before. He came to a decision in early June, on a Wednesday morning while he was mending a fence line along the south pasture. He was not a man who made decisions impulsively or without care, but he was also not a man who confused careful consideration with fear. He had thought about this enough. He knew what he wanted. The question was whether he could say it in a way that was honest without being presumptuous, that communicated the depth of what he felt without overwhelming or frightening a woman who had her own interior life and her own sense of who she was. He came into town on Friday. He went to the schoolhouse at the end of the school day, when the children had gone and she was cleaning the blackboard, and he waited in the doorway until she turned and saw him. "Timothy," she said, setting down her eraser. "I'd like to talk to you," he said, "if you have a moment." She read his face. She was very good at reading faces. "All right," she said, and she sat down on the front bench of the schoolhouse, folding her hands in her lap, and looked at him steadily in the way she had. He came in and sat down across from her on the opposite bench, his hat in his hands, and for a moment he just looked back at her, gathering himself. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said, "because I think you're a person who prefers that." "I do," she said. "I have admired you from the first conversation we had," he said. "And over the past 2 months, I've come to feel a great deal more than admiration. I think you are one of the finest people I have ever encountered, and I find myself thinking about you constantly, and I find myself wanting things with you that I have never allowed myself to want with anyone before." He paused. "I'm not asking you to marry me today. I want to be clear about that. I know that would be hasty, and I know you're still finding your feet here, but I am asking whether you have any interest in allowing this, whatever this is between us, to grow into something. Whether you would be willing to spend more time with me, intentionally, with that purpose in mind. She was very still throughout all of this. When he finished speaking, she looked down at her hands for a moment, then up at him. You built 2 rocking chairs, she said. He blinked. Yes, he said. And a table for 6, she said, and a wardrobe with a mirror, and a bed with leaves carved on the headboard. She paused. You built all of those things before you met me. Before I knew who it was for, he said carefully. I knew it was for someone, she exhaled slowly. I liked Marcus very much, she said. And I believe I loved him in the way that you love someone you choose carefully and live with honestly. It was a good marriage. She met his eyes. But I want you to understand that I don't intend to marry out of necessity or loneliness or because it's what women do. If I choose someone again, it will be because I want that specific person, because they make my life better in ways that are real and not imagined. I understand, he said. Do you? She said. I do, he said. And I wouldn't want it any other way. She looked at him for a long time. He sat quietly and let himself be looked at. I think, she said finally slowly, that you might be the most intentional man I have ever met, and I think I would like to spend more time with you. She paused. Intentionally, he breathed out. Good, he said, but slowly, she said. As slow as you want, he said. She smiled then, the full smile this time, the one that changed her whole face, and he thought that if he could produce that smile on a regular basis, it would be an entirely worthwhile way to spend a life. They courted through the summer of 1879, and it was, in the way of things that are done slowly and honestly, one of the finest summers of his life. They rode out together on Saturday afternoons when she had no other obligations, sometimes just the 2 of them and sometimes with the Pruitts, following the creek up into the hills where the aspens grew, and the wildflowers were so thick in July that the air smelled like something you'd pay good money for in a city. They ate dinner together at the Calloway house sometimes, or at the Pruitt place, or occasionally Timothy cooked, and she came to the ranch and they ate at the big table and afterwards sat on the porch in the rocking chairs and watched the evening come down over the hills. He learned her. He learned that she was funny in a dry, understated way that sometimes took him a beat too long to catch, and that when he did catch it, she appreciated the delay. He learned that she was fiercely principled about things that mattered, the treatment of children, the honesty of language, the obligations of those with resources toward those without, and that she did not moralize about these principles but simply lived them. He learned that she had a complicated relationship with sleep, doing most of her best thinking in the hours before dawn, and that she had strong opinions about coffee, which she believed should be made properly and not just approximately. He learned that she could ride reasonably well but preferred to be driven in a wagon on long distances, and that she liked the smell of pine resin and fresh sawdust, which he thought was perhaps not coincidental given the amount of time she had recently spent around a man who produced those smells regularly. She learned him too. He could tell, watching the way she watched him, attentive and storing, the way a good teacher watches students not just for what they say but for how they say it. She learned that he was quieter than most men, but that his silence was not emptiness. It was full of things he was thinking, and that if you waited patiently enough, they would eventually surface in words worth hearing. She learned that he was more tender than his exterior suggested, that he stopped to check the water level in the creek each time he rode by it because of the cattle downstream, that he kept a clean and careful record of his accounts, and his herd in a ledger he updated every evening, that he fed his horses before he fed himself, and had done so consistently it was no longer a decision, but simply the order of things. She learned that he had built a house with morning windows and 6 chairs and a second shelf above the stove at her height before he knew her name. She thought about this more than she mentioned. There was a moment in July, a warm evening on the porch, both of them rocking gently, the fireflies beginning in the meadow below, when she said almost to herself, I think this might actually work." He looked at her. "What do you mean by that?" She looked back at him. "I mean you and I think we might actually work." "I've thought so for a while," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm a bit slower." "You're not slower," he said. "You're careful, there's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid," she said, "after Marcus, that I had already had my piece of good fortune and that expecting another was unreasonable. That life doesn't generally give a person two chances at something real." He said nothing, waiting. "But you are," she said, "quite thoroughly real, Timothy, and so I have revised my position." He reached over in the dark and found her hand where it rested on the arm of the rocking chair, and he covered it with his. And she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the dark with the fireflies in the meadow and the creek sounds below, and it was one of the best moments of his life. He proposed to her in August, on a Saturday afternoon, in the meadow above the creek where the aspens grew. They had ridden up on horseback and dismounted, and were sitting on a fallen log looking down at the valley below, the patchwork of his pastures and Herschel's land, and beyond that the distant rooftops of Harlan's creek glinting in the sun, and he had the ring in his coat pocket, a simple gold band he had sent away from a jeweler in Denver, with a single small garnet because he had heard her once say that she liked red, and because garnets were more honest than diamonds. He took it out and held it without putting it on display, just held it in his palm while he spoke. "I love you," he said. "I have been fairly certain of it since January, when I was building a chest of drawers at 2 in the morning, and thinking about a woman I hadn't met yet, and realizing that the woman I was thinking about had become, in my imagination, quite specific." He looked at the ring. "And then you arrived in March and were even more specific than I'd imagined, and more than I'd hoped, and I have spent every day since trying to be the kind of man worth choosing." He looked at her. "I think you might be the making of me, Della. Not because I need fixing, but because you make me want to be more of what I already am." He held the ring out. "Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and then at him, and her eyes were bright in the August light. "Yes," she said, "I will." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it for a long moment, then looked at him, and he leaned forward and kissed her for the first time, gently and carefully, and she kissed him back without hesitation, and the aspens around them made their thousand-leafed sound in the warm wind, and the valley below was gold and green in the summer light, and he thought that no amount of careful building could fully prepare a man for the actual arrival of the thing he was building toward. They were married in October 1879, on a clear Saturday with the aspens turned gold and the air sharp and good. The ceremony was at the small church in Harlan's Creek, presided over by the minister whose wife Della had spoken with at her welcome gathering, and the whole town came, or near enough the whole town, because Della had in 7 months become one of the people the community built itself around, through her school and her steadiness and her willingness to be genuinely present in the life of the place. Margaret Prout cried. Herschel Prout stood straight and tall in the third pew and looked entirely composed until the moment Timothy said the vow, and then Timothy saw the old man's jaw work for a moment before he got it under control. Timothy found this more moving than he expected. Della wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself, and she had flowers in her hair from her kitchen garden, the last of the autumn asters, purple and white. She walked to the front of the church on her own, which was her right as a woman with no family to give her away, and she walked the way she did everything, with a directness and a self-possession that Timothy found, as usual, entirely captivating. He stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him, and thought of the table he had built, and the chairs and the rocking chairs and the bed and the wardrobe and the chest of drawers and the second shelf above the stove, and thought that all of it had been building toward this exact moment. This woman walking toward him through a golden October morning in Colorado, her brown eyes steady on his, her mouth already beginning to smile. She reached him and took his hand, and the minister began. The words of the ceremony moved through him in a kind of warm haze of attention and feeling, and when it came to the part where he was to say the vow, He said it looking at her face, not at the minister, because the words were for her and she deserved to hear them spoken directly. "With this ring," he said, "I thee wed," she said hers back to him in the same direct way, and the gold ring she had brought for him, plain and solid, went onto his finger, and he felt the weight of it with a satisfaction he hadn't anticipated. They walked out of the church into the gold October morning as husband and wife, and the town cheered around them, and someone had flowers to throw that scattered across the church steps and the pale morning air, and Della laughed and leaned up and kissed him on the cheek in front of everyone, which made several of the older ranching families exchange glances of amused approval. The wedding supper was at the Calloway house, long tables set up in the yard, and there was food enough for twice the people present, which was exactly how me Calloway operated. There was dancing in the evening, fiddle music from old Pete Larson and his son who played together, and Timothy danced with Della, and then with Margaret Prout, and then with Della again, because he did not want to dance with anyone else. He held her close during the last dance of the evening, slower now, the fiddle singing something that might have been a waltz or might have been something Pete Larson had invented for the occasion, and she had her head against his shoulder and her hand in his, and he could feel her breathing. "We're going home," she murmured. "We are," he said. "To your house," she said. "Our house," he said. She lifted her head and looked at him. "Our house," she agreed, and the words had a completeness to them, like a joint-fitting, cleanly home. They rode out under the stars, her beside him in the wagon, his horse tied at the back, and the night air was cold and smelled of autumn, and she was wrapped in her shawl and leaning against his side, and the lantern at the front of the wagon threw its small yellow circle onto the road ahead. When they pulled up to the house, there was lamplight inside. Margaret Prout, who had left the party early on the excuse of a headache that no one quite believed, had come ahead and lit the lamps and stoked the fire and left a fresh pot of coffee on the stove and a small bouquet of late autumn flowers on the dining table. Timothy made a mental note to patch whatever fence Margaret Prout wanted patching for the next 10 years. Della stood in the middle of the room and looked around at the lamplight, the fire, the flowers on the table, the chairs, the books on the shelf, and then she walked through to the bedroom and stood looking at the bed with its carved headboard. "I've been thinking about that headboard since May," she said. "Have you?" Said from the doorway. "You put a lot of care into this," she said. "Into all of it," she turned. "Into building something you believed in before you had any real reason to believe in it." "I had a reason," he said. "I just didn't know her name yet." She crossed the room and put her hands on his chest and looked up at him, and her brown eyes were warm and dark and entirely his. "You are," she said, "the most extraordinarily specific man." He put his arms around her. "Is that a complaint?" He asked. "No," she said, "it is not." They settled into their life together the way a good piece of furniture settles into a room, with a rightness that felt less like adjustment and more like arrangement fulfilled. She moved her 63 books into the house, and they joined his small collection on the shelves, and he built another shelf to accommodate them, and the room was immediately better for it. She taught school Monday through Friday, and rode home in the evenings on the small mare he had acquired for her, a sensible gray named Juniper, and he had supper ready most evenings because his day started earlier and ended at a more predictable hour than hers. And she would come in with her hair escaping and her arms full of papers to mark, and he would take the papers and set them on the sideboard and hand her a cup of coffee, and she would drink it standing up by the stove and tell him about her day. He loved this. He loved the specific ordinary texture of it, the dailiness that he had spent so long building toward without knowing exactly what it would look like. He loved that she had strong opinions about what to cook on which night of the week, and that she organized the pantry in a system that he genuinely could not follow but that she could navigate with her eyes closed, and that she had placed her own things on the second shelf above the stove, the one he had built at her height, and that it fit as though he had measured for her specifically, which in some unreasonable way he had. She loved the house. He could see it in how she moved through it, with a comfort and ownership that had arrived quickly and felt permanent. She rearranged some of the furniture, not much, moving the second rocking chair from the bedroom to the main room where it looked better, adding a small table between the two chairs on the porch for their evening coffee cups, putting a piece of fabric over the trunk in the corner that improved the room considerably. She did these things without asking, and he thought they were all improvements and told her so, and she said, "It's because I have a good structure to work with." And he understood she was not just talking about the furniture. Winter came again, the winter of 1879 into 1880, and it was different from the previous winter in every way that mattered. The house that had been empty and cold and full of solitary purpose was now warm with two people, and the evenings that had been given over to building furniture were now given over to reading and talking, and the particular companionship of two people who have chosen each other and keep discovering new reasons to affirm the choice. She read to him sometimes in the evenings from her books, choosing passages she wanted to share, and he listened with his eyes closed in his rocking chair. And there was something about being read to, about receiving something she had decided he should have, that was unexpectedly intimate. He told her one evening in December about the winter before, about what it had been like to build the furniture through the cold months with the goal of a woman he didn't know yet. "I used to talk to her sometimes," he said, embarrassed, "while I was working, just out loud to the room, telling her what I was making and why." Della was quiet for a moment. "What would you say?" she asked. He thought about it. "Things like, I'm making the edge of this table round so nobody gets hurt getting up fast. I'm making 6 chairs because a table ought to have more than enough. I'm making the headboard with leaves because a person deserves something beautiful to look at when they wake up." He paused. "Mostly I was explaining myself, trying to make the building intentional rather than just busy." She was looking at him with an expression he had come to recognize as the one she wore when she was moved but was managing it. "You were courting a stranger," she said. "I suppose I was," he said. She reached over and took his hand. "I'm glad it was me," she said. "I'm glad I'm the one you were talking to, even when you didn't know it." "So am I," he said. In February of 1880, Della told him she was expecting. She told him on a Sunday morning in the kitchen while he was making breakfast, and she said it matter-of-factly because she did not perform things, but her hands were not entirely steady when she said it. He set down what he was holding and looked at her. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "So am I," he said. "A little." She looked surprised. "You are?" "Of course," he said. "It's a considerable responsibility, but I'm also," he said, "very glad." She exhaled and the steadiness came back into her hands. "Good," she said, "because I am too, glad, I mean, alongside the frightened part." He crossed the kitchen and held her, and she put her arms around him, and they stood there for a while in the morning light coming through the east windows, and he thought about the house and the furniture and the life and how each thing had led to the next, the way a good road leads through one good landscape into another. He began building a cradle that week. He had no plans and made none, working by instinct and by the knowledge of what a small person would need to feel held and safe. He built it with gentle curved runners so it could rock, and he made the sides high enough to be protective, but low enough that a parent could reach in easily. He turned decorative rails for the sides on his lathe and assembled them with the same clean joinery he had used on everything else. He carved small leaves on the end panel to match the headboard, a continuity that he did not overthink. It simply seemed right. He finished the cradle in March and brought it into the bedroom and set it near the window, and Della came and stood over it and ran her hand along the curved runner and said nothing for a long time. "It matches the headboard," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him with bright eyes. "You're going to make me cry," she said. "That's not my intention," he said. "I know it isn't," she said. "That's why it works." The spring and summer of 1880 moved through in their particular way, busy and warm and full of the specific texture of a life being lived. Della continued teaching through April and into May, when the roundness of her was becoming evident, and she judged it appropriate to inform the school board. which she did in her direct way, and which the school board accepted with the slightly startled grace of people who were not entirely sure what the protocol was but were pragmatic enough to work it out. She taught through the end of the spring session in June and then came home to the ranch for the summer. The summer was, he would think afterward, one of the best of his life. They were together all day in a way the school year did not allow, and the rhythm of the ranch absorbed her without diminishing her. She had opinions about the garden and the chickens they had acquired, and about the fence line project Timothy was working on along the eastern pasture. And she helped where she could help and occupied herself with her books and her letters and her own thinking where she could not. They ate lunch together every day sitting on the porch, and this small daily thing became one of the things he valued most, the midday pause, the plates between them, her voice and his in the warm afternoon. Their son was born on the 4th of September, 1880, delivered by Doc Mercer with Margaret Prout assisting, in the bedroom with the carved headboard. In the bed Timothy had built the previous winter for a woman he hadn't known yet. It was a long labor, and Timothy spent most of it in the main room doing things with his hands that did not need doing, reorganizing the firewood stack, and then reorganizing it again, until Margaret came out and told him to come in. The baby was red and loud and had, when his face was not contorted with the outrage of having arrived, the delicate, blunt features of someone who was going to look like his father. He weighed a solid amount and had dark hair and a voice that Doc Mercer said would carry across a good-sized pasture. Della was exhausted and radiant, and held the baby with the instinctive sureness of someone who, it turned out, was extraordinarily good at this too, and she looked up at Timothy when he came to the side of the bed, and she said, "He's here," in a tone that was different from any tone he had heard her use before, stripped of all the composed self-sufficiency and just simply full. "He's here," Timothy agreed, and his voice was not entirely reliable in that moment. "What shall we name him?" she said. They had discussed names and had not quite settled, and Timothy looked at the baby who had closed his eyes and subsided from outrage into something more like suspicious truce with the world. "George," Timothy said, "for your father." Her father had died before she left Kansas, and she had spoken of him with a love that was still present and specific. She looked at him. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember everything you tell me," he said. She looked down at the baby. "George," she said, trying it. The baby did not object. "George Ralston," she looked up. "Yes, I'd like that." George Ralston arrived in the world in September 1880 and proceeded to make himself thoroughly at home in it, occupying the cradle with the small leaf-carved panel, and as the months passed, growing into the kind of child who had opinions from a very early age about how things ought to be. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's capacity for direct attention, and he discovered at 4 months that the world was interesting and set about engaging with it with a dedication that made both his parents simultaneously proud and tired. Herschel Prout, who came to see the baby 3 days after his arrival, stood over the cradle with the same jaw-working emotion he had displayed at the wedding, and then looked up at Timothy and said, "Good." That was all, just good, but it meant everything. Life on the ranch settled into the particular depth that a family makes when it is rooted and attended. Timothy expanded the herd gradually, adding to the cattle operation with care and without overextension, learning the land he was on, the way it held water and the way it dried in late summer, and the best routes for moving cattle down to the lower pasture when the upper grass thinned. He had a good operation by 1882, not large by the standards of the big ranching outfits to the north, but solid and well-managed, and his. Della returned to teaching in September 1881, when George was a year old and the new school year began. She made arrangements for his care during school hours through an arrangement with me Calloway, whose youngest children were old enough to be reliable, and rode to town each morning and back each evening, and managed both the school and the household with a competence that Timothy admired and was also careful never to take for granted. He told her this once. in the way he told her things, directly and without ornamentation. "I don't want to be the kind of man," he said, "who lets a woman run two things and forgets to notice." She had looked at him with the full warmth she saved for moments that genuinely moved her. "You're not," she said. "You never have been." In the autumn of 1882, Della told him she was expecting again. This time she told him in the same matter-of-fact way, but there was no accompanying trembling, only a steady brightness. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "Better than the first time, actually." He built nothing this time. He did not need to. The house was full and complete. The cradle was in the corner of the bedroom where it had been since George outgrew it, and they had moved it there rather than put it away, because putting it away felt too final. Their second child was born in May 1883, a girl this time, with Della's brown eyes and an expression of serene observation from her first hour that made Doc Mercer laugh and say she was going to be a judge or a philosopher. They named her Ruth. George, who was 2.5 and had strong opinions about everything, inspected his sister with a critical seriousness that made Timothy bite the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling, and then declared, "She's small," in a tone of mild complaint. "She'll get bigger," Della said. George considered this and appeared to find it acceptable. Ruth Ralston grew into her brother's assessment, becoming less small with notable efficiency, and proved the doctor right in the matter of her temperament, watching the world with a steadiness that recalled her mother's and her father's quiet attentiveness both. She was placed in her earliest weeks in the cradle with the leaf-carved panel, which held her as it had held her brother, and the continuity of it, the wood that Timothy had shaped years before for a future he could only gesture toward, holding this specific child in this specific room, was not lost on either of them. There was a September evening in 1884 when Della was grading papers at the dining table and George was asleep in his bed, and Ruth was in the cradle, and Timothy had come in from the barn and washed up and sat down across from her at the table with a cup of coffee and a book. And the lamp was making everything gold, and the fire was going, and outside the first cold of autumn was settling in, and he looked up from his book and looked at her. At the particular angle of her head bent over her papers, the dark hair escaping its pins, the small frown of concentration she wore when something a student had written required her full engagement. He thought about the winter of 1878, himself alone in this house with sawdust on his clothes and a growing collection of furniture and the particular ache of a man building towards something he can't quite see. He thought about the knock on the door in March. He thought about the welcome gathering and the window and the cup of tea. He thought about the schoolhouse steps and the fireflies in the meadow and the aspen grove on a warm August afternoon. He thought about her walking toward him through the church on their wedding morning, the autumn asters in her hair, her brown eyes steady and warm and already his. She looked up from her papers and found him looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just looking at you." She studied him for a moment in her thorough way. "You have that expression," she said. "Which expression?" "The one where you're thinking something quite specific that you're deciding whether to say." He set down his book. "I was thinking," he said, "that I'm very glad I spent that winter building furniture." She set down her pen. She looked at the table between them, the same table he had built in November 1878 in the cold evenings by the fire, and at the chairs around it, and at the room that had been filled by the two of them over 5 years of living in it together. "So am I," she said. She reached across the table and he met her halfway, and they held hands across the wide surface of the table he had made, and outside the autumn wind moved through the pines and down the hillside, and in the bedroom Ruth made a small sound and then was quiet, and somewhere in the house George turned over in his sleep, and the fire ticked steadily in the hearth, and the lamp burned gold and even, and neither of them spoke for a while. Because there was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already present in the room around them. It was Herschel Prout who said it best. One Sunday in the late autumn of 1884, when he came for supper with Margaret and found the Ralston house as it usually was on Sunday evenings, warm and full, George careening around the main room with the particular focused energy of a 4-year-old. Ruth in her chair regarding the chaos of her brother with philosophical calm, Della at the stove, Timothy setting the table, the smell of food and the sound of the fire. Herschel stood in the doorway for a moment before anyone noticed him, looking at the scene, and when he came in and hung up his coat, he said to Timothy quietly, while the rest of the room went on being itself, "A man doesn't always know what he's building toward when he starts." "No," Timothy said, setting out plates on the table he had made. "But sometimes," Herschel said, "if he builds carefully enough, it turns out to be exactly right." Timothy looked at the room. At the table and the chairs and the rocking chairs and the books on the shelves and the lamp and the fire and his wife at the stove and his children in the living room's beautiful disorder. "Yes," he said, "sometimes it does." The winter of 1884 came down on the Colorado hills the same way all winters came, hard and final. But the house stood against it the way it had always stood, solid and warm. The big east windows going amber in the mornings when the light came through. The porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs side by side. The fire drawing clean and hot. The dining table long and wide with 6 chairs around it, and often more pulled up from the corners because there was always room. Because that was how the table had been built, to have more room than it needed, to be generous by design. Timothy Ralston had spent the winter of 1878 building furniture for a home he did not have a wife for yet, working alone in the cold evenings by firelight, talking sometimes to a woman whose name he didn't know and whose face he couldn't see, building toward a future he could only imagine. In the winter of 1884, that future was completely and specifically real. It was Della at the stove and Della at the table and Della in the rocking chair with her book and Della's voice reading to George at bedtime, rising and falling through the wall in the old stories. It was Ruth's small face in the morning. It was George's particular laugh. It was supper and coffee, and the evening's reading with the fire going and the wind outside working at the eaves. It was every morning with the light coming through those east windows, falling across the woman who slept in the bed with the carved headboard, falling across her dark hair and her closed eyes and the particular piece of her face in the early morning, before the day had begun to ask anything of anyone. He built that too, he supposed. He built the east windows to catch that light, and the light fell exactly where it was supposed to fall, and the woman was exactly who she was supposed to be, and the life was exactly what it had always been reaching toward. A man doesn't always know what he's building toward when he starts, but sometimes, if he builds carefully enough and honestly enough, and with enough faith in the possibility of the thing he cannot yet see, it turns out to be exactly right. It turns out to be this. A winter morning in Colorado in the year 1884, a house full of living, a woman's hair dark against a white pillow, a child's laugh through a wall, a fire in the hearth, a table set for supper, 2 rocking chairs on a wide porch waiting for the afternoon. It turns out to be a home that knows what it is, and a man who knows why he built it, and a woman who chose it and chose him and filled it with herself until the house finally, completely, became what it had always been trying to become. It turns out to be enough. More than enough. It turns out to be everything.